Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Continuous Context-Specific Analysis, Collaborating with Protection, Security, and Peacebuilding Actors to Support Informed Humanitarian Action. Just some housekeeping issues before we get started. Due to the large number of participants, we've muted your microphone to ensure optimal sound quality, but feel free to send questions throughout the webinar via the question box, and we'll try and address those in the question and answer session in the latter half of the discussion. Now I'll hand things over to our moderators, Jessica and Lackey, to kick us off.
Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Jessica Lenz. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Protection here at Interaction, and I lead the work on results-based protection and gender-based violence. I'm also here with my colleague,
Lackey, peacebuilding. I'm the Security Director here at Interaction. Hi, Jessica.
Hi. So great, we're both going to moderate this webinar together. So we're pretty excited. We have a wealth of different panelists here to join us, and I'll introduce each of them in a few minutes. But for those of you who are joining us that are less familiar with Interaction, Interaction is a consortium of around 200 member NGOs engaged in both development and humanitarian action. And Lackey and I both sit within the humanitarian team at Interaction and are focused on strengthening policy and practice of humanitarian action. So to kick us off, I just wanted to provide a bit of background for this webinar and why this discussion. So under our work on results-based protection that Interaction has been leading on for the past 5 years to strengthen protection and practice, continuous context-specific protection analysis is a key element of our framework that supports the achievement of protection outcomes. We've been exploring analysis by engaging with multiple actors from different disciplines and sectors to understand their approaches and methods. Last year, we did a webinar with Search for Common Ground, exploring analysis from the perspective of peacebuilders. And also last winter, we had the opportunity to engage with the Interaction Security Advisory Group during their annual retreat to present some of our work and to look for opportunities for collaboration. It's from these initial conversations that have led us to this webinar. So we realize that oftentimes what each of us is analyzing, though we may call it something different or our ultimate goal differs, the information and even the methods we are using to conduct analysis is relevant to each of us. So for example, within protection, it's essential that we understand the specific components of risk in order to address a protection issue. And by protection, I mean anything from gender-based violence, recruitment of child soldiers, landmines, kidnapping, and so forth. So this requires that we fully unpack and disaggregate the context-specific patterns of threat, vulnerability, and relevant capacities, and how they manifest throughout the crisis environment. Some of the issues that we need to understand include looking at the conflict dynamics within a crisis, who are the actors, how they are motivated in making decisions, what are influencing factors that can be brought to bear on shifting behaviors, attitudes, and practice to prevent or stop protection issues from occurring. We also need to understand how affected populations are vulnerable to these specific threats and what capacities they have to overcome them. This necessitates having a robust context-specific protection analysis to help us identify and design an appropriate response that can support the achievement of protection outcomes. In our conversations last year with peacebuilding community, we recognized that they too were seeking to understand similar factors, although perhaps for the purpose of different outcomes. For example, among peacebuilding actors, analysis tends to be focused on the drivers of a conflict. They may be seeking to understand historical factors, social grievances, and key influencing factors within the environment, such as trends and triggers that may give rise to violence. At the same time, peacebuilding actors will explore how communities solve issues on their own and where there are entry points for building resilience or mitigating the escalation of further conflict. So while protection actors may call these components threat, vulnerability, and capacity, in essence, we are often looking at the same things, though with a different lens. So in terms of security, Lackey, how about that?
It's very similar, Jessica. Good security is based on context-specific risk assessments. The purpose of NGO security is to develop safe access and durable presence. So the first step to develop that is figuring out what threats in our environment may prevent us from developing that access. So we run a risk assessment. A risk assessment is when you analyze social, political, economic conditions in a given area and identify specific threats that may either harm staff, programs, or assets of your agency. We then assess the likelihood of that threat materializing and the impact it would have should it materialize. All measures we take from then on should address these identified risks, including mitigating measures and contingency plans. But it should all start and flow from a risk assessment. And throughout my time in our discussions, I've watched how often protections work and concerns are similar to those of security. In both cases, we are frustrated with a lack of meaningful analysis that is needed for reducing risk either to beneficiaries or staff. Instead, we often favor process-oriented analysis that is designed to fulfill administrative standards. For example, we frequently expect to provide general advice on how to keep staff safe, regardless of what specific and actual threat is on the ground. Or we often ask to provide security assessments and input into a project proposal that's just about to be submitted, which means you can't run a real meaningful risk analysis. I remember when I was in Bosnia, actually, to help run elections in Brčko. It was a highly contested and strategic town. Our security briefing consisted of don't wear ostentatious jewelry, don't be alarmed if you hear gunfire, and try not to walk outside after dark. Meanwhile, political tensions in town were at boiling point, and there was a direct threat of physical violence against us as election monitors. But since there was no risk assessment, there was no mention of the threat in the briefing, and there was no proper mitigating measures. The morning after our election, our office was actually burned down. So we're here to compare notes here and possibly commiserate. This webinar is an opportunity to bring together multiple actors across disciplines to share their approaches and learn from each other how we can strengthen opportunities for collaboration. And our objectives are explore how actors monitor the components of risk, threat, vulnerability, capacity on a continuous basis for contextualizing interventions in real time, identify tools, methods used by these actors, how they monitor and continuously analyze the changes in patterns in the environment, and how analysis informs decision-making, adaptation, and organizational strategies, identify synergies and opportunities that can be utilized between sectors to ensure meaningful analysis in support of collaborative outcomes.
Great. Thanks, Lackey, for getting us started. So I want to now turn to our panelists. And we have 5 panelists who are joining us from both or not just both, but security, protection, humanitarian, and the peacebuilding community. But as a way to introduce each one of the panelists, I'd like for each of you to describe your approach to analysis in no more than 2 minutes. In other words, what would be your elevator spiel or your selling points, noting specifically what trend or pattern or change you are tracking? So I'm going to begin actually with security and introduce Nick Lee, who is the Executive Director of the International NGO Safety Organization, INSO, to kick us off and let us know how you see analysis.
Okay, good morning. Well, first I'd like to dispute your disaggregation of humanitarian and security. To my mind, those things go together, and security is a humanitarian function and vice versa. I think just to quickly introduce people to INSO who aren't aware, INSO is the primary security coordination mechanism for NGOs at field level. We've got around a dozen or so platforms across the world and about 800 national and international NGOs participating in sharing security information and conflict analysis through those. The primary, we have a lot of different functions within each of those contexts, but the primary one, of course, is conflict monitoring and analysis. I think just listening to your introductions, the thing that stands out for me as different for us from, say, protection or peacebuilding actors would be that our purpose, the intent of our analysis, is to intersect with NGOs perhaps at a different level than most organizations. So we're aiming to intersect with them at both the strategic but also a kind of tactical decision-making level, so more day-to-day situational awareness and activity planning. Just to come to what we do briefly, like I said, conflict analysis, the primary unit of that unit of analysis is incidents. So we devote a large part of our organization to the collection, verification, and organization of incident data. An incident would typically be, any discretely identifiable event that you could categorize chronologically, geographically, and as a particular type of activity. We'll then organize those into internal databases, which forms the primary source of at least quantitative-based incident data that we can analyze. Just to run through quickly into less than 2 minutes some of the key elements of that, I think geography and chronology are critically important. Georeferencing data wherever is possible is particularly important in a place like Syria or Iraq, where you have quite significant and frequent changes in front lines. And I think chronology is very important to identify key risk periods. I'm very struck by, we put out a lot of information on typical times for bombings in Kabul in the morning, for instance, and you'd be surprised how much NGOs can mitigate very context-specific risks simply by leaving for work later in the day. So geography and chronology are certainly very important elements. Actors has been mentioned already. We like to keep track of actors, who's controlling the terrain, where we operate, where NGOs operate, and linking that to network analysis to understand the relationships between actors. I think for our purposes, assigning initiation is very important. It helps us understand who has particular momentum in the battle. And arguably the most important element is what we would refer to as TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. So those that have perhaps been in the military will understand that as an acronym. I think this is more around knowing how personnel, how weapon systems are deployed within any particular context. And this is the thing that most directly affects, I would say, the security risk assessment that you're able to make in the country, because it links it concretely to how personnel and weapon systems are being used specifically in that context. Not necessarily it can't necessarily be gleaned from a generic sense. And what I mean by that, to give some concrete examples, is, for example, IEDs. You need to understand what the trigger mechanisms are, whether they're victim operated, whether they're remote operated. And this can have a direct correlation to the type of mitigating measures that you're going to recommend to your staff and your organization. And finally, I would say victims is a very important element. Know who usually dies is a very good proxy indicator of intent. And most importantly, allows the easy identification of outliers. So unless you have a very strong record of who has been affected by what type of TTP, then you're not really going to know when something is outside of the norm. So I think, INSO focuses a lot on the very deep disaggregation of victim data, gender, nationality, working group, right down when it comes to NGO incidents to the type of program that they're working on. And all that information really helps you understand when an event has taken you outside of the norm within that context. Beyond that quantitative stuff, we utilize our field presence to monitor more qualitative dynamics, group formation, network and actor analysis. Like I said, area of influence. We do a lot of work in terms of who's able to bring influence over a particular piece of territory. In places like Kenya, Somalia, that takes on tribal and ethnic dimensions. And then finally, we'll also track a number of NGO-specific variables, like the estimations of intent, the NGO victim profile, things like that. All of that ultimately comes together to enable us to make very specific, context-relevant recommendations and provide very specific information to NGOs that's actually applicable to the environment that they're working in.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. I now want to turn to protection and introduce Hani Mansourian, who's the coordinator for the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, and will be speaking to us about the situation and response monitoring toolkit that the Child Protection Group has been working on. Hani?
Hi, thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so as Jessica mentioned, I'll just briefly introduce the Alliance. Some of you are familiar with the Child Protection Working Group that existed since 2007. Alliance was one of the functions of the Child Protection Working Group, which last year kind of came out of that chapeau, and but it's the same kind of standard setting and normative work that that was happening under the working groups of the Child Protection Working Group. So what we do is development of standards. The minimum standards for child protection and humanitarian action, for example, is one of our products, and technical guidance for the field, for those who are serving children at the field level, and basically, and it's an interagency group, so it's a network of almost 100 organizations and hundreds of individuals who are part of it, who form working groups and task forces and work on specific technical areas. This project that I'll be presenting sits under the working group called Assessment, Measurement, and Evidence Working Group, that is responsible to generate evidence and help organizations who are active at the field level to generate better evidence to inform their programming. The project that is called Situation and Response Monitoring Project came about based on the understanding and recognition that child protection risks and ability of the affected populations to respond to them change over the lifetime of an emergency. This is not a new realization or recognition. It's just the child protection sector is relatively a young sector relative to, for example, health. So it's in our progression as a sector and maturing as a sector. This is about 3 years ago, we started thinking about, instead of going about doing our programming in the same way that we have always been doing, meaning we define a program today when the emergency starts or a conflict starts, and then we kind of carry over and we keep asking donors to fund the same things over and over again without real analysis of the situation, to see whether the risks and vulnerabilities and the capacity of the affected population has changed in the past 6 months, and maybe we should focus on something else. And we have had a lot of evidence of us kind of as a sector continuing to focus on, for example, recruitment of children, while child labor has become a major issue, and we haven't necessarily given it enough attention because we were so focused on just doing what we initially thought was the problem. So the intent behind the type of generation of data that we do through the monitoring toolkit is to directly impact our programming and advocacy. So it's not a case finding mechanism. For example, there are mechanisms that we can use to find specific cases. This is more to look at trends and changes in the pattern of protection issues, so that we can then inform our advocacy with policymakers and donors, and also adjust our programs. Now it's a bit of a challenge to do that because of both our organizational structures, where when you define a project, for example, on recruitment of children to armed forces and groups, you hire specific staff for it, and then 6 months later, if you find out that that is not really an issue anymore, or it's not as much of an issue as separation of children or child labor or other protection issues, changing all of that structure that you have set up is a big challenge. Donors do not necessarily like to keep changing. Organizations don't like to keep changing, but they're all interested in knowing exactly what is happening so that they're relevant. So it's a process that we're going through, and we're hoping that we find mechanisms that this data that we are producing through the toolkit can directly impact our programming and doesn't become yet another set of reports that go into a shelf. The toolkit has two specific components. I'll try to be brief. One is response monitoring, one is situation monitoring, and we specifically mention those in the title of the toolkit to highlight the relationship, but also the distinction between what is happening as in the situation, the protection issues and the capacity of the population, versus what we are doing as the humanitarian community. And those two, even though they interact with each other, they are two conceptually independent pieces. And we look at both, partly because we want to make sure that we don't assume that if you're responding to, for example, separation of children from their caregivers, necessarily the situation is getting better. Sometimes, because we don't look at this situation, we're actually incentivizing potentially more separations. And then hopefully, if you have the data from both, we can then cautiously, and I emphasize cautiously, claim some causality of what we are doing in terms of response, hopefully having some impact on the situation, but not taking that too far. I can go on and on about this, but since I'm given only 2 minutes, I'll stop there, and then I'll continue talking about these two components of the toolkit in the next sections or based on questions. Back to you,
Great,
Jessica.
thanks. Yep, thanks so much, Hani. It was a great introduction. Now I want to turn to Tyler Rundell, who's the Global Analyst from Action Against Hunger, or ACF, to speak perhaps on the general humanitarian side of analysis.
Good evening or morning. So I work for an analytical unit that's currently embedded with Action Against Hunger. And our particular focus is trying to bring analysis much more prevalently into the humanitarian sector with the specific purpose of trying to inform decision making. And to this end, we're just finishing up our 2 or 3 years of a pilot program in which we've developed a well-defined analytical toolkit that's really been tested and developed for the humanitarian sector and specifically. And this toolkit is based primarily on foresight analysis, which you can think of as a form of futures-focused context analysis. And the toolkit follows a series of what's called structural analytical techniques. And through these different processes, we search to understand what are the system of interactions between the major actors and factors that really define a context or a specific situation. And we then try to understand which of those are really central to the system and could represent sort of good leverage points for affecting positive change. And how we then take this from just a present time study to how we can understand future strategy is by then understanding the trajectory some of these issues take, some of these factors and actors, and trying to then understand how these contexts may evolve into the short to mid-term future. And based on this, we then also develop a series of scenarios which outlines a series of possible futures to give people a better perspective on how the future might unfold, and therefore allows for better planning and decision making. We also then have a series of strategy planning sessions that we can host with decision makers outlining these scenarios so that they can then optimize a strategic plan that accounts for these different contingencies. All right, thank you. That's my 2-minute speech.
Great, Tyler. Thank you so much. We'll now turn to Joe Bubman, who's the Acting Peace and Conflict Director for Mercy Corps, to provide not only humanitarian but a peace-building perspective. You'll have to unmute.
Hi everyone. So Mercy Corps provides humanitarian assistance, promotes development, and advances peace building. And in our peace building work, we aim to prevent conflict by promoting social cohesion, peacefully resolve and manage conflict through dispute resolution, and reduce participation in violence. And our work is very much grounded in analysis. And so today, I wanted to share a couple of different tools. The first one I'll talk about will be our context, conflict, and do no harm analysis worksheet, which we use to analyze the context, analyze conflict dynamics that affect male and female adults and male and female youth, and explore the possible impact of those different groups of various interventions. One thing to highlight is that what we've really tried to do from a protection lens is analyze how different conflict dynamics impact men, women, young males, young females, people with special needs in different ways, and to take those into account in our interventions. The second tool that I'll share today will be a 7 elements preparation tool for access negotiations with armed groups, since so often when we're providing humanitarian assistance, those efforts depend on the ability to negotiate for access with state and non-state actors. And so I'll share the analysis that we do when considering whether to engage with armed groups by analyzing the context with external stakeholders, and then analyzing the dynamics that involve our armed group counterparts.
Great, thanks so much, Joe. And our last panelist that we'll turn to is, again, from the security sector, and this is Alicia Fairbanks, who's a research advisor from the European Interagency Security Forum. Welcome, Alicia.
Thanks, Jessica. So the ISF is a bit different in that we focus more on aid worker security and ensuring that there's collaboration between different security focal points amongst different NGOs. So we're an independent network of security focal points, and at the moment we have over 80 European-based NGOs. Some of the panelists belong to some of our members. And many of these NGOs are predominantly humanitarian focused, but we do have some human rights-based organizations and development-focused actors as well, who all operate internationally. And so what we try to do is encourage collaboration between these different NGOs, and we also try to support information sharing networks and other coordination bodies, of which INSO is one. But we also focus on regional level. For example, in the Middle East, we've got a security focal point coordination group, and we also have at country level within Europe, so for example in Spain and in France. And we also try to support efforts such as those of humanitarian outcomes and insecurity insight that collect and share incident information across multiple organizations at a global level that really enable strong analysis within different NGOs. And one of the things that we also tend to do more on a context-specific side is if, for example, one of our members has a question about a particular context, say, for example, they are planning to set up operations in Albania, they can contact us and we will try to find out who within our membership is operating in that country, that we can then put them together in touch with each other so that they can share useful information. And what we have found in our work is that there are really significant benefits to coordination, particularly for security and particularly for humanitarian access, because of course the more information you have about a context, not just the one that you collect, but also that which is collected through initiatives like the panelists before me have discussed, it allows for better analysis, it allows for better decision making on operational decisions and on security. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later on.
Great, thanks everybody. So those are our 5 panelists, and now we're going to dive a little deeper into understanding some of their tools and methods for analysis. And I'll turn it over to Lackey.
Thank you. So now that we have an overview of these different methods and approaches that are being used, let's dive into how this is being done. Humanitarians and peace-building actors may have different objectives, but we may be monitoring similar factors within the crisis, as we mentioned before. Joe, what do the Mercy Corps context, conflict, and do no harm analysis framework and the 7-element preparation tool for access with armed groups comprise of, and how do these help you monitor changes in the crisis environment? And it's a 2-part question. If you could answer the second one as well. Are the tools adaptable to different contexts or actors?
Sure. So I'll start with the second question, which is that they're absolutely adaptable to any context, because essentially what they enable you to do is to analyze the context, and they rely on a framework that promotes a very thorough analysis. So let me start with the first one, which is our context, conflict, and do no harm analysis worksheet. We use it to analyze the context, including conflict dynamics that affect male and female adults and male and female youth, and we explore the possible impact of an intervention to help people disaggregated by sex and age within those context and conflict dynamics. So this can inform design or implementation of either conflict-sensitive development programs or peace-building interventions that aim to address conflict directly between groups and prevent violence. So we took what many may be the context analysis, sort of a standard conflict analysis framework that many folks may be familiar with. It helps you analyze context and conflict dynamics. We took that and we integrated it with sort of a do no harm framework, which helps you analyze the context and then the impact of the intervention on the context. And so we integrated the two so that you can analyze the context, conflict dynamics, and the intervention. And so the steps of the process are to first identify the groups in conflict. What are the conflicting groups that experience tensions that either have erupted into violence in the past or have the potential to become violent? And then analyze the context and the conflict across different systems. So thinking about governance, considerations, economic factors, ecological changes, and social factors. And then aside from the general context, users are prompted through a set of questions to think about what are the grievances different groups experience across these systems? What are the resilience capacities that different groups, these groups in conflict, can use to mitigate violence? Who are the key mobilizers politically, economically, socially? What are some of the trends and triggers, such as elections and other events across the systems that can potentially escalate conflict? And again, our focus is thinking about the impact on men, women, young males, young females, people with special needs, elderly, children, disabled, sick, families at risk, etc. So after analyzing the groups in conflict and the context and conflict dynamics, we then work with our teams to analyze the proposed intervention. What are the details of projects that we're considering? Who are we assisting? Who are we not? Where and where not? Resource transfers. How might an influx of goods, for example, create a market effect? And how are we assisting? What implicit ethical messages might we be sending through our behavior, through our intervention? And then finally, based on that analysis, what are options and opportunities for improving the design and implementation of our program? So for example, if there are certain risks of dividing groups or exacerbating tensions through our intervention, how can we mitigate those? How can we lessen the negative impact? And then on the other hand, based on the resilience capacities that we identified that can connect groups or help overcome tensions and grievances for men, women, young males, young females, and people with special needs, how can we strengthen those resilience capacities? So this is an analysis that we expect our teams to conduct during the design of programs and at least quarterly through implementation. It can be used in any context. And then just quickly, I'd love to share our 7 elements preparation tool for access negotiations with armed groups. This is a topic that we presented on at the Interaction Forum, recognizing that, again, the ability to provide humanitarian assistance often depends on successful negotiations with state and non-state actors. This guidance focuses on armed group negotiations specifically, primarily because there are many statutes, there are many policies and laws that sort of describe what is permissible and what is not when it comes to armed group negotiations, and we wanted to make sure that our teams don't run afoul of material support statutes when it comes to organizations that are considered foreign terrorist organizations. That said, there's also lots of opportunities for communication that would enable us to achieve our access negotiation goals while adhering to humanitarian principles of impartiality and operational independence and humanity. And so just quickly, we rely on the 7 elements of negotiation framework that was first developed at the Harvard Negotiation Law School in 1979, captured in the book Getting to Yes. And what we do is we encourage our teams to think through each of these 7 elements of negotiation to determine whether engaging armed groups makes sense. So for example, in terms of the element of relationship, do we have enough of a relationship with the armed group that we can reasonably expect to influence them if they are making a demand or or preventing us from accessing a certain vulnerable population? In terms of communication, would it be problematic if other armed actors found out about our communication with the armed group? Interests, what do they want, and could we satisfy those needs without running afoul of humanitarian principles? Options, how likely is the group to be open to exploring creative options that would result in a better outcome for us than the status quo, which might be, stopped in our tracks and prevented from moving forward and accessing a road perhaps that would enable us to access a makeshift IDP camp. Legitimacy, do we have an opportunity to persuade them using standards such as the core humanitarian principles I mentioned before and international law? Alternatives, what are the negative consequences if we don't negotiate with them, i.e. what is our BATNA? What's our best alternative to a negotiated agreement? Does it mean just not providing goods to this vulnerable population? Is it having to operate in a different geography? And finally, commitment. Do they have the authority to do what we want them to do, and are they present in the operational area? So this sort of analysis enables us to develop security strategies, make program adjustments to reduce risk while ensuring access. It enables us to then think through what would be a principled approach to negotiate for access. How can we explore our interests and theirs, generate options, and rely on independent criteria such as international human rights law, other international law, and humanitarian principles. And so we support our teams in conducting this analysis and then thinking through how best they can negotiate for access with armed groups and non-state actors.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very interesting. And I read through your papers. Moving along from a security perspective, I know INSO collects a great deal of information about the crisis environment, including the different dynamics between actors and social political factors. Nick, can you elaborate on how your methods help to identify trends and patterns of change in the crisis environment?
Yeah, sure. I think just to start by clarifying, I think the intent for us in participating in this is not necessarily to share a specific toolkit that users can or listeners can apply to their own context. I think it's more that INSO is an organization that is dedicated to analysis in and of itself, as opposed to a project or a particular type of toolkit. So for us, I think it goes back to the point of intended purpose being really the driving factor here, and I think that's one thing that I would encourage everyone to really consider, is that the purpose of analysis really should drive the shape of your collection, your verification, your analytical processes, and of course for us, our purpose is quite different from everyone else. In the sense that we have a community level mandate to advise organizations operating in these high-risk countries. But anyway, notwithstanding that, I think what I'd like to highlight is the things that I see as the organizational components that enable us to do that, which I think for anyone that wanted to set up a similar type activity, I think would be really key to consider. The starting point, I think, just comes down to attitude. I'm often like to say that INSO is an NGO doing security rather than a security organization for NGOs, and having that humanitarian identity come first, I think really keeps us focused on programming, access, operations, rather than the kind of traditional restrictive bunkerization approach of security. The vast majority of INSO personnel are, NGO workers themselves who've, worked for more traditional NGOs previously. And I think that plays a big part in us being able to understand the purpose. So the reason why we're providing this information analysis and the end state to which that's being applied to. So I think that's the starting point, is having the right attitude and understanding what NGOs actually need analysis for. There's no point, creating it just for the sake of creating it. The next important element, I think, would really be the composition of the workforce. As much as there is a kind of modern trend towards trying to digitize analysis as turn it into something that can be done automatically, ultimately we see it as a product of human intellect. And a product of human beings' ability to synthesize and draw patterns between, often disparate sets of information. And as few of the other panelists have commented, that can change quite quickly within any different context. So ultimately, the analysis you can produce is only as good as the people that you have producing it. So I think, on that basis, what we've done at INSO is we've diversified our workforce. So yes, we have, traditional security skill sets on the teams, but we've also branched out into academics, researchers, people with language specialties, country or thematic experience, so people who are quite at home in the environments that they're operating in. And I think ultimately this enables a more holistic kind of sense of the conflict. The bottom line is the more angles that you can approach security from, and I said at the outset, I kind of jokingly disputed the disaggregation of humanitarian and security, but I find it's a bit of a problem within the sector. People tend to see security as a stovepipe add-on that is very much focused on the protective elements of that and the restrictive elements of it. We take a very different approach, and we see it as an enabling, facilitative element, and an element that should be mainstreamed. We give practical life to that by having some services that are specifically designated towards country directors only, for instance, as a way of re-mainstreaming the kind of responsibility and awareness. And that's where you can bring in the things that they're more interested in terms of political analysis, social analysis, economic factors, things like that. So the bottom line, the takeaway should really be, I think, approaching, understanding that security isn't just about, guns and bombs, and it isn't only about what you can restrict and shut down, but how you can conduct access safely. I think is very important. A third very important element, I think, is field presence. I really can't overstate this. Typically, we have 40 to 100 people in every country where we operate. And so we're not doing this as a kind of academic exercise from the capital city somewhere. And I think being able to be a primary source of direct information collection with individuals and teams living in the environments that they're assessing really undermines or underpins the kind of credibility of the information that we're able to provide, and we really try to maximize that, pushing people out as far to the field as we have, and we've been pretty successful in terms of getting people into often very hard to reach areas behind front lines. I think we have the structural advantage, of course, over most organizations that we don't have to deliver anything. So we're not in the situation of having to bring large convoys or build infrastructure in these areas. So we're able to remain small, we're able to remain discreet, and that gives us the ability to be in places often where others are not. And of course, that's really important when it comes to supporting the kind of expanded humanitarian access discussion that really needs to go on at every country level.
Right.
I would say the next point is really around consistency and internal standards, collection, verification, presentation. INSO at this stage has developed standardized methodology for both collection and verification. So We do deploy a active network development system in each of our countries. So we'll go into a country, we'll identify which parts of that society have the information that we need, who within those different vectors specifically would have that, and then we'll try to actively develop them as sources of information. We use what we refer to as proximity-based verification, so it's kind of similar to what you'd find in most national police forces around the world. So our ultimate, what it basically means is that depending on the proximity to the event of the source, different verification standards are required. So what it means is that if you're the victim or an eyewitness to the event, then your reporting of the incident is taken with a much higher level of credibility than people further away from that. And so the further away you get from the event, the more verification is required. We have recently introduced structuring around the very process of analysis. Analysis is quite a nebulous concept, and it's often confused with synthesis. A lot of people talk about analysis when they're actually describing synthesis, so the process of putting things together to draw a larger assertion. So it's important to understand the difference between the two. And that generally structures the way that we write. Without going into too much detail of it, we essentially follow a kind of expository structure of core assertion, evidence, implications. So whenever you're conducting analysis, it's always important to develop a strategic framework within which that analysis is taking place in order to orient it. And like I said at the beginning, it's what's very difficult to do is to understand whether a particular development is moving you further away from or closer to what you identified as a kind of desirable end state. So I think ultimately, all that structure and consistency is very important. I like to tell my own teams that as long as we're consistent, even if we make a mistake, we made it consistently over time, so we can always go back and roll it up if there's something to do. But I really can't emphasize enough that consistency in collection and the way you organize the information that you're having is super important.
Sure.
The last part I think I'd really highlight is this, highly differentiated coding and organization systems. We deal as an organization with an enormous amount of information. I think the last count we were reporting on around 15,000 verified incidents per month worldwide, which is a significant amount, and all of those have to go through a verification process and be geo-referenced and things like that. And it basically becomes impossible to handle such a large amount of information unless you have a highly differentiated coding system that allows you to really break it down into the kind of detailed information that you actually want. Again, I'll keep coming back to the fact that our job is to provide NGOs with information that isn't just a kind of good read. So we're not aiming just to be a strategic document that you can sit down and read at the end of the week or the end of the month and say, yeah, that's very interesting. What does it mean? We're aiming to provide people information that is relevant to them in a decision-making time frame of today. So, can I drive down this road today? Is it sensible that can I have a meeting with this person? What's their attitude towards NGOs? What's been the track record of incidents along this particular road, for instance? So having that ability to take large quantities of information and break them into a level of detail that is relevant to someone on a day-to-day time frame is very valuable and very important in designing systems like that. So I think I won't go on more than that. I'd be happy to answer any questions on it, but I think overall, we've created a system. Yeah, we've created a system.
We'll have a chance to do that at the end.
Designed to kind of push this information in both short and long term time frames. But again, like I said, it's not going to be, that's been designed for our specific purposes and won't necessarily be applicable or relevant to most others.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. Very impressive. So moving along, we know that another critical element when analyzing the crisis environment is starting with perspectives of the affected population. Hani, how does the situation and response monitoring toolkit for child protection allow for engaging with communities to better understand their knowledge of threats, vulnerabilities, and capacities that exist? And what role do you expect from the community and local national organizations to play in driving analysis and prioritization?
Hi, thanks for that question. I will just briefly kind of mention the structure of the situation monitoring component of the toolkit to answer that question. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, please.
Great, okay. Yeah, so the situation monitoring component has a secondary data review process and then primary data collection process. And in both of those, there is an element of involvement of the affected population. And when we talk about affected population, we kind of, because our sector is the child protection sector, deals with children as our primary beneficiaries. But we, at the same time, when it comes to collection of data, communities and those who are there to protect children, which a lot of the time becomes community mechanisms and adults around children, but also children themselves, have a role to play in providing information as well. So I'll speak to the role that local organizations have in the situation monitoring toolkit and the process, and what the role that the community members and caregivers of children have, and the role that children themselves have. One of the, I would say, beauties of this toolkit is that even though it provides you with a lot of options in terms of methodology, which are to an extent rigorous and reliable in terms of the data that they produce, but they're also simple, quote unquote, in their applicability in the field. So it provides us several options, but the actual choice of which option, which methodology should be used in the field lies with the organizations who are doing the data collection at the field level, which in majority of cases are local organizations. So there's this whole process defined within the toolkit of engaging with local organizations, or rather I would say partnering with local organizations to define what it is that we are trying to measure. So for example, is it issues related to armed forces and groups and recruitment and use of children, or is it issues related to separation of children? Is it issues related to child labor that is most important? So you define the issues with the community groups and local organizations, but also international organizations who are part of the collection of data. But as I mentioned, at the end of the day, it's oftentimes the local organizations who actually collect the data. So we partner with them in defining what it is that we want to measure exactly, what methodology we want to use to measure it, or what methodology is most appropriate for that context, and then engage them in the actual collection of data and analysis. So in every step of the way, local organizations are involved. One of the methodologies that is there for considerations, which happens to be the methodology that was chosen both in South Sudan when we piloted this starting in 2015 and still going on, and in Gaziantep in Turkey, but for the Syria response. They both opted for the methodology that is called the community-based primary data collection. So it basically embeds data collectors, or actually, rather than embedding, I should say, uses individuals within communities that take on a role of a more protective role themselves, either already in that role or they would like to be in that role, to be the ones that provide the data for our analysis. so the community-based data collection was chosen both in South Sudan and in Syria. And in that process, rather than an agency like Mercy Corps or Save the Children or anyone else going in and collecting the data, we train community members to provide the data to us. In South Sudan, because of issues related to cell phone service, we opted for a written kind of a old school pen and paper style reporting. In Syria, they opted for a more high-tech approach to it, so using ODK to collect the data. So there are differences in the way that toolkit actually was adapted to different contexts, and that speaks to its adaptability and flexibility in taking the shape that is most appropriate for the context. And the affected population or the communities then provide the data on an ongoing basis. And at the end of the process, there is at each period. In South Sudan, they define it at 3 months. In Gaziantep, I believe that they define it at 4, if I'm not mistaken. They collect the data. They have an interpretation process, which speaks to a point that Nick was also mentioning, it confusing synthesis. You used the word synthesis and analysis. For us also, we go beyond just putting data into shorthand, mean and median and percentage. Rather, we take it one step further, what we call through an interpretation process, in which again we involve local organizations and community members to see what the data actually means. So if 15% of reporters reported an increase in separation of children from their caregivers, is this something that we should have expected because of a seasonal trend, for example, or it's something that is unusual? Just to give an example that really shocked me about, I think it was in 2012, we're using a component that ended up being in this toolkit to analyze the risks to children in Thailand after a flood that affected Bangkok and the surrounding. And one of the analysis that we came up with was that there was a significant difference between reporting on sexual violence when the groups that were collecting the data had more females in them. The numbers were lower when they had more males in the data collecting group. The reports were higher, which really shocked us. And it was only local organizations who were collecting the data who could tell us why that is. And it's a cultural had a cultural explanation that was very different from context that I had worked in before, which was women have an easier time talking to men in this context. And if it was not for that very close connection and involvement of the local organization in the interpretation process, you would not have known that. So it's basically bringing them in to make sure that we add, as again Nick mentioned, human intelligence into the more mechanical process of analysis. So what I basically tried to lay out briefly is the fact that at every stage of this, from designing the methodology, even though there are components of it that should be there for it to function, but there's a lot of room for choice from that point all the way to interpreting the data that comes out. There's room for participation of local organizations, community members. And the last one I will speak to is the children themselves. There are components of the response monitoring that has very clear kind of processes, child-friendly processes for receiving feedback, and a lot of it has to do with satisfaction of children and them feeling that what we promise to them, so we call it promise cards. We define what we what we promised to them that we'll deliver, whether or not we delivered it. And there are very specific procedures that are defined for children to be able to also provide their feedback into the process. We are very careful with younger children, especially if you're talking about community-based data collection, where organizations that we can control a bit more in the sense of making sure that they respect policies and ethical principles are not necessarily present. When it comes to collecting data at community level, we do not encourage involving children under 14 years old because we cannot control the potential harm that it might cause to them. And it's a difficult decision in the sense of balancing the right to participation and the value of the perspective that they bring and their safety. But it's a choice that we have made that if we are not there to ensure their protection and the do no harm principle, we should not use children or involve children under 14 for data collection. But when we're there, we can go lower than that. Back to you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. The last section was really, really interesting from all of you. I want to turn to really the core of what this webinar is speaking about, though, is really looking at continuous analysis. And we know that with all of the different assessments that there's a lot of data that we're all collecting. But what about properly analyzing this information and how information is analyzed on a continuous basis in order to inform our decision making in real time? So if we return to Joe, let's look at then how Mercy Corps monitors change on a continuous basis. Could you speak to the concept of iteration and perhaps elaborate on the methods that enable you to look at change on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, and what this really looks like in a practical sense? So whether that's meetings or reportings or specific software that you're using in order to analyze change.
Sure. So in general, our context, conflict, and do no harm analysis worksheet is what we rely on to most thoroughly analyze the context and conflict and our intervention on a continuous basis. So we encourage our teams to, at least on a quarterly basis, get together, make sure you have a cross-section of folks who are involved in implementing the program, including our local partner organizations, go through the questions and think deeply about what are grievances that have emerged across governance, economic, and ecological social systems, what are the ways in which we might unintentionally, inadvertently escalate conflict between groups through our intervention. And then based on that, based on sort of the full analysis that I described earlier, what are the actions that we should take to mitigate the risks and strengthen resilience capacities? Now, how do we know whether we are potentially escalating conflict in some way? How do we know if we are exacerbating tensions? We rely on a social cohesion index because we think that this is one of the best indicators in terms of measuring the quality of relationships across some line of division. This helps us determine whether we are, in fact, strengthening relationships between groups as we intend to do, or unwittingly exacerbating tensions. And so it's an index of 6 indicators that include trust, interactions, positive interactions between groups, percentage of people who believe there are benefits to cooperating, tolerance and diversity in terms of perceptions of positive perceptions of the other groups, social inclusion, percentage of people who believe they have a voice, and collective action, percentage of people who are willing to work towards a common good with others in their community. And so by collecting data on these 6 indicators across the index on a regular basis, we can then make some very clear determinations about the quality of relationships, the level of trust between conflicting groups, and what are we doing or not doing that would increase social cohesion. And so we take that data and then we use it to adaptively manage our programming.
Great, that's really fascinating. Alicia, one way we know that different actors look at continuous analysis is through incident monitoring and tracking, and I think it's used across many sectors, particularly protection as well, in addition to security. Can you speak briefly on how security actors approach incident tracking and any challenges associated with this approach?
Yeah, sure. So incident reporting, I think, is an easy way to do a type of continuous analysis, because I would assume that most organizations already have a system in place to monitor and report incidents internally. And there are a lot of benefits, actually, of joining a mechanism, say, like INSO, or at a more global level, Humanitarian Outcomes, their Aid Security Workers Database, or Insecurity Insights Aid in Danger project, where you can put in place mechanisms to record incidents internally, but also to then report them externally into this database, so that these entities can then create these trend analyses, and that way you can identify patterns that you can then make decisions upon. I mean, for example, a serious security incident like a kidnapping, that should automatically trigger a reassessment of the context, because obviously something went wrong, and so that's a very easy trigger. But if you look at less severe incidents, or what we call near misses, if you analyze these together, you can get a bit of a trend analysis going that would evidence a change in the context, something that's quite subtle that maybe you wouldn't have realized otherwise, which can also then trigger a much needed reassessment of the context or the organization's position within that context. And if I were to give an example, if, for example, you were working in a community, but your staff are getting not very threatening, but still some threats coming from a certain section of the community on a regular basis, maybe that's not something that your staff feels is something that needs to be assessed. But if your security focal point is getting these reports and you're monitoring that, then you might realize, well, maybe we're doing something wrong in that community. Maybe our acceptance strategy is faulty. Maybe we're developing a bad reputation, and that can trigger then a more in-depth look into what's going on there. So in that sense, incident reporting internally within your organization is really key, and I think the big challenge is to get staff to report near misses, to report incidents that they might think, oh, well, I got stopped at this checkpoint. The soldier was a little bit aggressive. Oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. It can be a big deal if it's develops into a trend. And so having this strong system in place to monitor this is really key. And NGOs do this in different ways. They can do this through Excel spreadsheets. They can do this through really expensive software packages, online systems, whatever works for you. But having it in place is really key. It is a very good way to do continuous analysis.
Great, thanks so much. We often hear, I think, a genuine desire for more analysis. This is specifically coming from the protection community, that we all want to do more analysis and also quality analysis. One of the things that we have found, though, that it often is around the organizational cultural policies that prioritize analysis. Tyler, can you speak to ACF's organizational culture and how this has helped to support the use of this analytical unit or method within the organization?
Yes, well, I would definitely agree that within the sector we're seeing particularly the rise in a lot of these monitoring and evaluation requirements. And as a result, we're definitely getting these large volumes of data coming in. And we do have a much stronger need now to analyze that for the patterns and that we're starting to see, so that we can make better decisions based on this data. But one of the issues that we've noticed is just these monitoring and evaluation programs often consume a lot of time and funding resources. And often as a result, organizations simply just don't have the ability to then dedicate additional staff to really focusing on the analysis itself. So as important as monitoring and evaluations are, there really is a need to have an organization being willing to commit resources and staff specifically for the analysis side. And we at ACF have been really very fortunate. ACF has supported my analytical team's whole pilot program with guaranteed funding for several years. And part of that really gets into not just the institutional culture, but almost the identity of ACF. They really view themselves as a smaller, more flexible and responsive organization than some of the other major ones. And they kind of pride themselves on their use of analysis for going back several decades. And as a result of that identity and cultural issues, they've been willing to actually not just speak to their commitments to analysis, but actually being willing to dedicate the funding to support our organization in this program. And what we've actually found is once they were willing to create an analytical unit, it really is filling a need that had been unmet by many people, both within the headquarters and in program offices themselves. And I think this also ties into sort of a deeper cultural issue that is within the humanitarian sector. Humanitarian response is by nature very reactive. The idea is a crisis occurs and people go to respond to the crisis. Ideally, they take care of it and then they leave. And by that nature, you don't really have to be as analytical if you're only viewing things as isolated incidences. But over the past number of decades, we've all realized that most of these crises are cyclical or part of larger problems. And as particularly we're talking about the need to bridge the humanitarian and development divide, we have to overcome some of this cultural legacy within the humanitarian sector. And part of this is really dedicating a lot more resources to analysis and being much more proactive instead of reactive. And one other point just to mention is a link with academics. And academia is really important in their role in creating knowledge and more relevant to us, but creating some of these tools and techniques that could be of use to us. But the issue is most of these are being created in more of a theoretical framework, and so it does take actual time and commitment to take some of these academic tools and then specifically tailor and test them for use within the humanitarian sector. And that actually does take a significant amount of time and resources just to be sure that the tool is properly calibrated to having the right kind of effect that we're looking at to truly make it effective.
Great, thanks so much, Tyler. I think Tyler alluded to the need and the amount of resources it actually takes to do analysis and to do it on a continuous basis. Hani, I'm wondering, given the pilot and the rollout of the situation and response monitoring toolkit, what have you found in terms of what's required for staff capacity, resources, time, funding, or even other factors to ensure the continuous nature of analysis is maintained throughout the response?
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I mean, I think I first want to emphasize on the importance of analyzing existing data, as Tyler was talking about. There is, in the protection sector, we do suffer from not enough data, but what we suffer more from is not using what exists. So I think we have emphasized in the toolkit to make sure that an analysis of secondary data takes place as part of the methodology, as one of the very few fixed components of the toolkit is the secondary data analysis. We recommend that regardless of the context, we want them to look at what exists before they go and collect primary data. But some of the other learnings one is the importance of feeding back the information that is coming from the field. So the more you can turn the data into usable analysis and interpretation, and feed it back at different levels of data collection. So if organizations in the field are supporting this monitoring mechanism, which I should emphasize, it's a bit too large for one single organization to use. So we normally recommend this to be managed by the coordination mechanism. If it's in a cluster system, the cluster coordinator for child protection, or the subcluster coordinator, and in refugee settings, normally it's a UNHCR coordinator. So it's normally beyond, so in both contexts where we have fully rolled this out, it has been beyond just a single organization. But then it's important for each of those organizations and also the community members to see some level of feedback for them to then feel that they can actually continue or they see value in continuing to provide high quality data. So that's one. Feedback is one. The other one, and that's more short term, but longer term, they have to start seeing some sort of change based on data that they're producing. If for example, the data that comes from the field tells you consistently that again, I'm going to use the example of child labor. Child labor is an important issue, and it's affecting a large number of children. But then they go to their donors, and the donors say, sorry, we don't fund child labor. After 6 months or 8 months, the organizations are going to question, so why are we producing this data if the analysis is not informing how we can engage with our donor and hopefully program to respond to the needs. So it becomes very important for the coordinator and those involved in analyzing the data to make sure that the analysis informs some level of advocacy with the donors and policymakers, so that the organizations who are providing the data then see the value in continuing to produce high quality data. And sometimes it's interesting, even if it's the feedback that I was talking about is only at the level of when they send their data, receiving a response that says, oh, I couldn't necessarily make sense of this data point or that data point. That already increases enthusiasm of organizations and community members to actually provide continuous data. So I'm basically using telling you about how analysis, and it's the kind of cycle of analysis that leads to feedback and leads to potentially change in attitude of policymakers and donors, creates a cycle that is a healthy cycle for continuous analysis. Another kind of very practical learning that I wanted to talk about is which we kind of started off about 3 years ago, hoping that we will be able to get the coordinator or the information management officer in a humanitarian response to take on the role of rolling out the monitoring project and maintaining it over time. But one of the learnings has been that it's almost we can say with very little doubt that in most contexts you will need someone who can dedicate a significant amount of their time in setting up the system, managing the data, making sure they're clean and analyzing it, producing the reports, feeding back, and pushing for advocacy and change in policies related to the data that is coming out. And expecting a busy child protection practitioner or a coordinator who already does more than 100% work to also add this potentially significant amount of work on the side is a bit unrealistic, which then speaks to the implication that it has for funding. The fact that when you're designing a project like this, you have to make sure that you request funding for I would say at least the 50% of its staff time, if not 100%, depending on the scale of the emergency. So those are some of the learnings that we had in terms of making sure that data comes in that links to analysis and continuous analysis and feeding back into programming.
Great, thanks so much, Hani. Let's turn a little bit to look at how we do joint analysis and what we would say under results-based protection, and one of our key elements is designing for contribution. So how do we engage multiple actors to contribute to protection outcomes or other outcomes? Alicia, perhaps at a global level, could you speak to whether or not the structure of the ESIF approach or method you use is suited for joint analysis amongst actors and sectors? And if so, can you elaborate on an example of when this has happened and what's needed to ensure effective collaboration?
Sure. So EISF itself does not carry out joint analysis of context with its members. So what EISF aims to do is to establish the framework that would enable this analysis to happen at more appropriate levels. So EISF establishes links with its members at headquarters level, looking more at good practice in security risk management, creating an enabling environment through forums and workshops as well as online, so that peers, so security focal points, can share concerns and advice with each other. And we hope thereby to create a stronger link at HQ amongst our members, which will hopefully translate into closer collaboration at the field or regional level on context-specific issues to enable this type of joint analysis to take place. What we sometimes do, if members request it, is create what we call sharing groups. So for example, at the early start of the Mosul offensive in late October last year, EISF members asked for a sharing group to be established, which we did via email, and members were able to share important updates in the context and developments, particularly HQ focused. And it's important to emphasize that these types of sharing groups should not replace contextual sharing groups at field or regional levels. So, for example, what INSO does, or what, for example, the MENA regional coordination mechanism does, because these are much more, these are better placed to provide context-specific information. And so what we really encourage and strongly support are these country and regional level coordination mechanisms. We support forums such as the French, the Dutch, the Swiss, and the Spanish NGO security focal point working groups. And I've already mentioned the MENA regional security forum. We have one in West and Central Africa as well. And these are smaller groups which also invite more local NGOs, so that they're perfect for sharing context-specific information and engaging in joint analysis. And I really encourage you to reach out to those groups that you think would be beneficial to your organization. And you can find some of this information on the EISF website if you want to know which groups are out there. And in terms of what is needed for effective collaboration, I think key to EISF's success has been respecting confidentiality. And information security is really paramount in security, not only because it creates trust, but it's really important to protect staff and beneficiaries in the field. If you're talking about case studies and particular incidents around staff who've been kidnapped, for example. So at EISF, we don't disclose any information without the express consent of those who have shared that information with us. And we often try to serve as intermediaries. So if a member would like to share information, for example, about a certain context or an incident, a mistake that was made that they learned from, but they don't want that information to be made public, to inadvertently get into the media, affecting their reputation, etc., then they can share it with us. We will sanitize it, and we will share it then amongst our network. So there is that protection intermediate level to sanitize that information. And what we also try to do, we have workshops, for example, where we might be talking about certain incidents, case studies, sharing information. We're also very careful about who is in the room. And so everyone knows who that information is being shared with, so they can feel confident about talking about sensitive cases. And we are big fans of the Chatham House rule. So yeah, what we have found is that EISF has built a very strong reputation in this regard in terms of confidentiality, and this has given members a lot of confidence to use us as a platform for collaboration, and that's a big key message from my side.
Great, thanks. Hani, I'd like to actually ask you the same question, particularly given the pilot that you guys have been doing, and it's more at the field level. So can you share with us what you've learned so far in terms of the toolkit and how actors have been brought in and are collaborating together?
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. No, I mean, I think one of the kind of inbuilt aspects of this toolkit is the fact that, as I mentioned before, it's more fit for an interagency kind of project than a single agency project. So by nature, at least in the two contexts that we have rolled it out, it has been fully an interagency project managed through the coordination mechanism. So by nature, it has that kind of involvement of multiple stakeholders and actors in it. In addition to that, one of the first things that we do in the steps that we have defined in the toolkit is first identifying what data collection mechanisms already exist and trying to use those as our entry points rather than creating a parallel mechanism. And that already opens a lot of doors in terms of collaborating with other actors at the field level, be it the nutrition cluster or IOM who collects data on internal displacement, the DTM, the displacement tracking matrix, or in Syria they call it NPM, I believe. So one of the things that we did in both of the contexts was made sure that we know exactly what is happening. In South Sudan, for example, we found a remote methodology that was being used by REACH to collect data from some of the protection of civilian camps, and we tried to plug some of the aspects of our data collection into that. In Syria, it was the same with the NPM that IOM runs. So these are some of the base work that we do before we even go in to hopefully increase collaboration across different organizations. Another aspect that we make sure that is very clear in the toolkit and in the way we do analysis is that we want to make sure that we avoid the analysis that comes out of the data becoming a tool for criticizing or blaming other organizations, but rather a tool to improve the way we do things and hopefully become more effective and remain relevant to the needs. So the response monitoring aspect of the toolkit, which specifically looks at the quality and coverage of response, inherently can play a role of shaming sometimes some of the organizations who may not achieve the same level of quality. So in both South Sudan and Syria, we made sure that the way that we define the reporting processes masks the kind of singling out an organization or an area which may be associated with operations of an organization in terms of the quality and coverage of response, but the organization itself has access to knowing that they actually ranked pretty low on quality, for example, and hopefully that will help them use the data to improve the quality of the response. So making sure that we're not creating competition or criticism to make sure that everyone remains involved and try to help each other move as a sector rather than as individual organizations. Also, there are examples that I can talk about, but I probably shouldn't, given we're running out of time, on protection monitoring, which the protection cluster runs. There has been a lot of interaction between the protection monitoring folks and the child protection situation and response monitoring project in Syria, MRM, which is the monitoring and reporting mechanism for grave violations. We try to use their data, even though politically we try not to be seen as the same as MRM. For some of you know that it's a very politically sensitive mechanism, but we use the data that they produce and we try to feed our data into their system so they can use it to better monitor grave violations. And also it has been used for advocacy with the education sector, for nutrition, when we, for example, find that there are areas in the path from home to, or from camps or villages to school that pose harm to children. We work with education cluster, for example, in making sure that we minimize potential of harm to children going from home to schools. I leave it at that, but there are lots of examples of collaboration in this project.
Great, thanks so much, Hani. Another question here, and this especially comes up when we start to talk about collaboration, is the fact that we're often all collecting information that's pretty sensitive. Within protection, we use the professional standards for protection that include standards on managing sensitive information. And there's also guidelines, obviously, and standards for child protection and gender-based violence. But I'm wondering, Nick, how does INSO balance protecting sensitive information with sharing with actors who may be able to help reduce risk? And in terms of security, what protocols or systems should be put in place to ensure the ethics of information sharing are upheld and respected?
Okay, I think the starting point is to understand that INSO is a confidential network, so it's NGOs only. It's information sharing between a particular group that's already self-identified in any case, and we don't have private sector, government, journalists involved in that case. And we uphold that very strictly. I think in the context of what we do, I would break it into two components. First, in reporting on NGO events themselves, the sensitive data in that will normally be limited to victims' organizational names, and potentially some of the specific operational details of an event. For instance, if we reported that Interaction got robbed because they pick up their payroll at 9 a.m. every Friday, that would be a very smart thing to do. So I think that it's about the extent of it in terms of what we report for NGOs. We address the vast majority of that through internal protocols, internal policy in terms of knowing what's risky information. We have a standing policy that all reporting is anonymous. It goes out from us in any case. There always have names of individuals and organizations removed, but then our staff are particularly oriented around looking for operational elements within the incident report that could potentially assign a risk to the organization onward. So in the vast majority of cases, that's pretty easy and obvious to do. I think in some of the more sensitive cases, like abductions, which certainly most of our members rightly are more sensitive around than perhaps other incidents, we'll tend to work directly with the organization to define a level of information that they're comfortable with releasing for other people's safety, versus balancing whatever response protocols or whatever actions they have going on in terms of responding to that. I think there's a little bit of an assumption for those that aren't involved in coordination within the NGO community that NGOs keep a lot of stuff to themselves. I think our experience has been that this isn't really the case. I think NGOs, from my perspective, are very responsible when it comes to sharing information with each other and doing so in a timely manner. I think the forum counts, and INSO, like I said, is an NGO only network, and I think this has done a lot to facilitate information sharing within our platforms in those countries. So certainly be more skeptical doing that in other forums that involved non-NGO actors within those. And I think we also employ with our partners, we have a voluntary code of conduct that NGOs sign up to when they register with INSO. has three basic components. The first is a requirement or an obligation to share incident information in the first place. So all the members of the INSO network are automatically providing notification of the incidents occurring to them. The second then is to keep everything that they receive out of that network confidential, so they're not in a position to distribute it horizontally outside their organization. And then the third one, which speaks to this, is around balancing Article 1 with the responsibility towards other safety. So NGOs will, of course, occasionally ask us to redact or leave out certain elements of the incidents that we're reporting on, and we will work with them to arrive at an appropriate release that effectively balances their needs with the requirement to inform others. Of course, the closer you get to the field, the more important this becomes, because it can have fairly immediate life-saving implications or life-threatening implications in that case. So for NGO, the work we do reporting NGO incidents, I would say that covers it. In terms of then conflict analysis, I guess different from protection actors, you will not find an INSO listing or an INSO database with individuals, protected special classes. So we're not keeping lists of people's ethnicity or religion or sexual orientation, things like that. So we don't have that information in the first place. Mostly what comes up within that is the sensitivity of parties to the conflict over how we're presenting that conflict. Of course, everybody wants to be the victim and the underdog, presenting the other as the aggressor and the illegitimate party. So we have to walk a fairly fine line often in terms of what we're actually presenting. Again, we've developed internal policy on that, very much founded on principles of impartiality and neutrality, and making sure that we're not adopting an unconscious bias through the use of language, through the way that we'll talk about the conflict. I mean, very, very simple things from the terms that will be used, which often you find just kind of default become negative terms towards what's generally seen as the bad actors, and positive terms as to see what's towards good actors. So we'll make a lot of effort to scrub those out of our particular narratives, and we'll have internal review systems in place to make sure that we don't wind up pointing too many fingers inappropriately. We do point fingers when they're legitimate to be pointed, and through a combination of all of those factors, the issue of information sensitivity doesn't really arise in terms of our analytical reporting.
Great, thank you, Nick. I know you have spent quite a lot of time and concern INSO has on this particular issue, and you're very methodical with what you do share and don't share. So turning the conversation to the usefulness of the information, obviously the points of these tools and methods is to produce useful information. They're intended to help us better understand the crisis and what changes we're monitoring over time, so that we can use the analysis to better inform and or adapt our response, right? So Tyler, I myself find forecasting and scenario development to be some of the more interesting part of what we do. I was wondering if you could speak to the foresighting analysis and scenario models that you use within a CF analysis methods, and whether this has supported real change in strategy or program design.
Hi. Yes, I fully agree with your initial point, and I think when we're talking about analysis, we have to really bear in mind what is the point of analysis, and making sure that we're not just doing analysis for the sake of doing analysis. And this gets into part of the idea that you're trying to propose with this continuous analysis program. So when we do analysis, it really should be integrated into the program with specific objectives in mind. And ideally, this should all go into basically creating more informed that we can run our programs far more effectively. To this end, we do take a lot of work in my specific analytical team with what we call foresight. And we actually specifically use the word foresight as opposed to forecasting. There's some technical nuances, but the idea generally is when people say forecasting, that's like the weather, where people try to predict the most likely outcome. What we do instead is what we call foresight. And foresight is basically outline several different possible futures. And the idea is that we're saying we don't know what the future will hold, but we understand several likely different possibilities we might face. And by understanding that range of possibilities, we can better plan for multiple contingencies so that we're not caught blindsided by a sudden change in a system or a trajectory. So what we do with our methods is that we do our general context analysis by understanding the series of actors and factors that contribute to the context and the situation. But then we look at the trajectories of each of those and try to understand, are those following a very stable trajectory over our time period, or is there a lot of variability, volatility, or basically uncertainty about how those issues might behave in the future, and to try to understand which are some of the most central uncertainties to the problem that we're facing. And we really then try to focus in specifically on those in our research, because we figure the ones that have the greatest uncertainty but the largest impact are very important in defining what the future may hold. And so based on those, we'll develop our scenarios of what the future might look like based on probable outcomes, a series of different probable outcomes each of those may hold. And what we do with this whole series of steps of our analysis is that we outline different possible futures, and then we have a second step in our toolkit where we have a participatory approach with decision makers in our organization or other relevant actors, where we then specifically design program strategies that can be optimized to fit various contingencies that we might face in the future. Ideally, we want to try and find a strategy that can meet most of our objectives in a wide range of different possible scenarios. But we like to outline a couple different possibilities and then allow the decision makers with this information to choose what they think is the best and most appropriate strategy. And to answer the second part of your question, we have had quite a lot of success, even just coming out of our pilot phase. We do annual reporting on our progress, and we've had generally very good feedback. Some of our outputs are less tangible because we are trying to change the culture of the sector, basically trying to get humanitarian workers and agencies to really think more about the future and be more strategic. But some of our more notable achievements are we've had contributed significantly to 5 country strategies of ACF and 1 regional strategy. One of our current reports is being used to develop a manifesto for our organization as a whole, and we have a number of other things in the work too. So far, we have had quite a lot of successes in this turning analysis into an actual output for decision makers.
Right. Thank you very much, Tyler. We are starting to run short of time, and we've had some other questions, but I think we're going to have to try to maybe address them as we go along and just move along to our next section altogether, which in fact is the Q&A part. Jessica,
yeah,
to you.
I mean, I think it's been a fabulous discussion so far and some really interesting information coming out. But just so that we don't lose our participants who've dialed in, we would like to offer this opportunity to write in your questions and so that we can direct those to the panelists. So if we have any questions, we'll start there, just so that we make sure that we have at least 15 minutes here before the end of our webinar. And we actually do have one question already, and this is directed to Joe from Mercy Corps, wanting to know a little bit more how you involve women and children in your analysis. So perhaps you could speak to that.
Sure. So I would say that the context, conflict, and do no harm analysis is the one of the two tools that I've shared thus far that involves a greater level of community engagement. And so when we're doing that, we ideally are conducting the analysis with our local partners, and therefore engaging civil society, men and women, and young people in those assessments. Now, sometimes we also conduct sort of joint market and conflict assessments with involvement of young men and women, and we recognize that, especially in our programming and the analysis that inform our programming, when we're focused on youth contributions to peace and also youth involvement in violence, that understanding why young people, what challenges they face and what they're hoping to achieve is really important. In particular, I'll just say that when in the research we've conducted on why young people participate in violent extremist groups, one of the things that's distinguished our research, I think, from others is that we have actually spoken with young people themselves who have previously participated or currently participate in those groups, and tried and asked them, both men and women, why they either participate in those groups, what led them to join, or why they resisted. So those are the ways that we try to involve women and youth in our assessments.
Okay, thanks so much. We have another question here, and it looks like it's directed at security actors, so either of you, Nick or Alicia, can respond. What role does information sharing with other security actors play in continuous monitoring, and what are the risks of this?
Do you want to go first, Nick, and then I can follow up?
Go ahead. No, ladies first.
Well, so sharing information with other actors, it's really helpful, especially if you've made mistakes, or if you've had a near miss, or if, for example, your staff was kidnapped in a certain region. Sharing the bare details, and I think Nick touched upon this already a little bit, immediately after the incident is really helpful. At a more global level, the accumulation of a lot of this data will then feed into trend analyses that allow senior managers or board directors to make really strategic decisions. So if you are noticing, for example, that a context is becoming really, really dangerous, and you have an organization-wide risk threshold or risk appetite that says that you will not work in a country where the risk of kidnapping or the risk of a fatality amongst your staff is high, then you can use that trend analysis to say, all right, well, why are we in this context then? We should pull out. So those strategic level decisions are easier, even if your own staff hasn't been affected. Using data from other organizations really helps. Some of the big issues, and actually in Security Inside, RED-R, UK, and the ISF have recently been working on a security incident information management handbook that will be published later this year with guidelines and some of the challenges around incident reporting and incident monitoring and analysis. And some of the challenges faced are kind of common. Underreporting. So your staff doesn't feel confident. They think maybe they will be blamed for it. Maybe they'll have a disciplinary action brought against them. In terms of sharing, a big concern that I've discussed within Security Insight is the lack of a common definition around what an incident is. So maybe an incident, say gunfire. Maybe one context that would be considered an incident, and another that's so common that it doesn't register, so you wouldn't report it. And that terminology, that definition, those definitions might vary across within an organization depending on the context, between staff, national staff versus international staff, or amongst different NGOs. So when you're trying to pool all that data, if one NGO talks about abductions, but another NGO is using the term kidnapping, how can you, it's really difficult to pool that information and compare it if you're not talking about the same thing. So there are a lot of challenges with that. I won't mention the confidentiality one because I think it was spoken about quite in depth in the previous section. But that is the main one. How do you trust someone if you give someone information that doesn't get leaked to the press, that there's no repercussion to you or to the staff who've been affected? But I think the one that many people don't think about is this underreporting, this near misses, and the common terminology. So within an organization, the best thing is to make sure your staff know and to use common terminology when you're joining these sharing groups.
Yeah, just to add a few things to that, I mean, broadly agree with all of it. I think there's a bit of there's probably a difference of perception between the level, sharing at a global level versus sharing at a country level. I think our experience has been a lot more positive. There's not a lack of information sharing that I really perceive in the countries where we operate. And I'd go as far as to say that I've really seen the culture change within the last 5, 6, 7 years or so. Cooperation at the field level used to generally be led by the UN, and I think that kind of naturally led to a bit of a lack of participation and a kind of watering down of the type of information that could be shared. But I think since INSO has been establishing NGO-led platforms in each of these the most high-risk countries, which is of course the priority for all of us, I've seen quite a change in the culture of that, and we have very high levels of participation. I know a number of NGOs that have already integrated community reporting into their standard SOPs and incident management procedures in country offices. So I think there's a bit of a difference on that. I don't see a big problem in terms of NGOs sharing information at the front end where it kind of, I would argue, matters somewhat more. I think, in terms of definitions, yes, it's true, but what ultimately has to happen, it goes back to what I was saying about picking a system and then sticking to it. Organization is very key within that. There have been a few efforts across the years to try and, standardize coding systems, definitions between a number of organizations, where I think probably the approach we've taken is different from that. We just standardized it for ourselves and then not given anyone any internal reporting criteria. So rather than getting 800 organizations all to do the same thing, we just let them report to us in any format that they like, whether it's over email, whether it's over phone, whether it's an SMS, whether it's a WhatsApp. We know what questions to ask in order to get the information that we need for our database and the way that we organize that. So we've taken the approach of standardizing it at the center, which I think is a much easier process to do and doesn't require you to get into the process of getting 800 organizations to agree on a definition of abduction or kidnap. As long as we know what we mean by it, then that's sufficient in those cases. So, is it important? Absolutely. Is it happening? Absolutely. Will it continue to happen? Absolutely. And I think, we've really entered, what I would call a bit of the second age of coordination within the security sector. It's very much moved on, like I said, from a UN-led and focused activity kind of prior to 2001, and then there would have been a bit of a ad hoc period where There were kind of ad hoc, somewhat disaggregated initiatives going on, and we've really entered a scene now where you have a kind of globally standardized architecture for that, and increasingly that is starting to be aggregated. One of the initiatives that INSO has just launched is what we're calling our Conflict and Humanitarian Data Center, the CHDC. We're effectively aggregating all of the country-level conflict events that we've collected over the years. And we'll be applying a user interface over the top of that, which will allow those who have access to it, which will be restricted to our humanitarian partners, to be able to conduct, their own more advanced interrogations and investigations of our data to support their kind of programming, analytical, and operational needs. There's a user interface over the top of that that automatically plots things into GIS, geo-reference data, so you can automatically produce maps and things like that from it. So yes, it's very important. It's definitely the new age of that within our sector, and I think the future of the sector is just more of the same. I can see it becoming more integrated, a little bit more technology-led,
sure.
And continuing to support NGOs on the outside.
I agree.
Can I add to that just really quickly that if you have any concerns about joining one of these sharing networks, just to reach out to them, because a lot of these concerns are being addressed. So if you do want to join but you have issues around confidentiality, just ask and they will try to support you. The ISF and Security Insight, I'm guessing INSO as well, Humanitarian Outcomes.
Right.
We don't observe those problems, but.
Great. Okay, so we're at the end, and we've had a lot of information this past 2 hours. I wanted to start closing it by asking all of you, what would you be doing? What do you think we would be doing better to strengthen analysis and continuous analysis in the future? And I would like to start with Tyler, please. And we're going to end it at that. But could you also just be mindful all the time, too, Tyler?
Yes, I'll try and be brief. What I really think is important is that when we think about analysis, we think about having a very specific purpose for analysis, and that we really integrate it into the program design rather than just doing it kind of on an ad hoc basis. I also really want to argue for the benefit of having dedicated analysts and not just trying to push analytical requirements onto already overburdened staff members. This can also lead to a deterioration in the quality. To this end, I would say that when doing proposal budgets, there should probably be a line item to request specific funding for analysis for the project itself. And just in general, that ensuring that the analysis is used for a purpose such as informing decision making. Thank you again.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Tyler.
you.
I know we would love to hear that question presented to all of our panelists, but we are really at time almost. But I really want to thank everybody for participating, for coming into this discussion, elaborating further from your sector on terms of what analysis looks like and how we can do this more collaboratively. Before we close, I want to turn it back over to my colleague Katie, and she's going to share with everyone about a call for examples that Interaction under our results-based protection program is about to put out, and explain a little bit about this before we say goodbye.
Thanks. So as we've discussed in this webinar, useful methods and approaches to continuously analyze and measure change in people's lives in crisis environments may come from a range of actors and disciplines. Interaction is seeking examples of those tools, methods, and approaches to collect and analyze data and measure changes in risk and protection outcomes. Of particular interest to us are participatory methods and tools which engage the affected population in response design, data collection, and analysis of protection issues that they face. If your organization is using tools like this, we'd love to hear from you. You can find out more on our website at protection.interaction.org. The deadline for the first round of submissions is August 11th, and to submit examples, you can send materials and the accompanying template, which is found on our website, to myself at kgrant@interaction.org.
Great, thanks so much, Katie. Lackey, any last words?
That's it for me. I think I'm done.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for participating.
Thanks everybody.
Looking forward to future collaboration.
Take care. On the dot.
Make sure that it will, hold on before you need to make sure that it totally captures the recording.